Good morning and happy Earth Day. Thank you all for joining us as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Wherever you're joining us from today, welcome. My name is Cynthia Quarterman, and I am a distinguished fellow here at the Atlantic Council's General Global Energy Center, and I'll be your moderator for this session. As we honor Earth Day, the environmental progress of the past, and the challenges of the future, I'm pleased to be joined today by an esteemed panel of global energy experts as we explore the implications of the energy system that has on the environment and the solutions that have been evolved to address them. For those of you out there, please note that this event is on the record and we're currently live streaming on Atlantic Council Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We encourage you to post what you hear today and share on social media using the hashtags Earth Day 2020 and AC Energy, and by tagging us at AC Global Energy. If you'd like to participate in our conversation today, we encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A portal, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time during this event, and we'll incorporate them as much as possible. Now, in turning to our virtual panel, it's my pleasure to introduce Mark Lambridis, Director of Global Energy and Infrastructure at the Nature Conservancy, Barbara Fenimore, Senior Strategic Director for Asia at the Natural Resources Defense Council, Emily Hirsch, who's a Managing Partner at DCDB Group, and Marco Magari, who's the Senior Vice President at Eni USA and the Chairman of the World Energy Council in Italy. We are very honored and excited to have them with us today to share their perspectives about all corners of the energy system. So you might be wondering, why are we here today, other than the fact that it's the 50th anniversary? For the past 2 decades since Earth Day began, we have all been focused primarily on cutting carbon emissions and mitigating climate change. And that's very important. But today we're going to reach back 50 years to Earth Day's bipartisan origins, which focused on conservation of resources, clean air, clean water, and appropriate land use issues. Beyond climate change, the global community must now come together to minimize not just climate change, but all the environmental impacts of energy production, transportation, and usage. As has happened in the past, when we've had collaborative efforts to, for example, protect the ozone layer, it's time for national governments, international institutions, energy companies, and the broader business community to come together to develop collective solutions to our environmental problems, while also meeting our much needed energy demand in an increasingly sustainable manner. Actors from across the energy sector, from renewables to hydrocarbons, have an opportunity to play a proactive role in meeting these environmental changes and in creating a cleaner, healthier, and more habitable environment. Our panel today will help us identify some of those possible solutions. Without further ado, I'll pass it off to our panelists for short introductory remarks, starting with Mark, followed by Barbara, Emily, and then Marco. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Cynthia. Good morning, everybody. The Nature Conservancy is a global NGO committed to a future where both people and nature thrive. Founded in 1951, we actually predate Earth Day and are excited to share in this celebration with the other speakers and participants today. Our main priority is really focus in on those issues you raised, Cynthia, like healthy oceans, fresh water and lands, and climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. As Global Director for our Energy and Infrastructure Program, I support the tremendous work of our energy and climate teams around the world. And together with colleagues like our North America Director, Nels Johnson, we partner with many state initiatives leading the fight to support the transition to renewable energy solutions that support our climate change commitments, while committing to steer the development to low impact environments. In fact, today's conversation touches squarely on the work we're pursuing via a program we call Power for Nature, that works to accelerate the deployment of low impact renewable energy solutions, which is why working in this space is just so incredibly urgent. We must successfully transition the energy world away from fossil fuels and highly impactful hydropower. Energy and climate really are two sides of that same coin, given the strong link between energy use and emissions. The top 10 greenhouse gas emitters currently contribute 72% of global emissions, and energy accounts for the largest share of those emissions, with 80% of global energy contribution based on fossil fuels. Accelerating the transition to clean energy will be essential to meeting the climate challenge. At the same time, we must work to meet the expected growth of our world's population, projected to be 9 billion by 2050, and the economic development, which is expected to deliver electricity services to an additional 1.2 billion people. To transition existing systems, power systems, and meet the additional growth, renewable energy generation will contribute over 3/4 of electricity supply growth in those years. That means something like 10-fold increase in wind power supplies and a 30-fold increase in solar PV. We may see a doubling of current hydropower supplies. This is critical for the climate, but the challenge this represents is that such increases have the potential to threaten natural lands and fresh water. Some suggest that as many as 10 million hectares and 300,000 kilometers of rivers could be negatively impacted in a business as usual approach where siting is unchecked. But there is a solution. TNC scientists have assessed the potential recently in a report from Paris to Practice that by siting renewables on already converted or otherwise degraded lands, there is over 17 times the amount of space necessary to meet the Paris targets for new renewables. TNC has developed programs to work with states and national governments to assess and target low impact development and locations and systems. Low impact can include energy efficiency and demand responses, building on rooftops, PV on rooftops, parking lots, former industrial lands, and low productivity agricultural lands. For example, we're implementing an initiative in West Virginia and Nevada called Mining the Sun, where we are facilitating the transition from former mine lands and other brown lands to productive renewable energy generation sites. In the US, the EPA assesses that there may be over 40 million acres of such sites across the country, representing nearly 7 million megawatts of potential renewable energy installed capacity. So to avoid land and community impacts, we're pressing for the development and use of system scale planning approaches. These start with the identification of low impact locations, overlaying on solar and wind resource maps, critical environmental and social layers that can help with strong initial low impact siting. For example, a toolkit called Site Wind Right does this for 17 states in the US, where developers can easily find identifiable, viable wind locations. We have found that when social and environmental layering is built into the planning and policy matrix, there to be as much as 50% reduction in the project permitting times and lower demands for offsite mitigation payments. In the end, we can demonstrate that low impact smart planning not only leads to reduced environmental and social conflicts, but ultimately fewer project disruptions, lower development costs, and in fact, acceleration of the renewable energy transformation itself, which we so need. So Cynthia, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with everyone today, and I look forward to the questions throughout this morning's panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Barbara?
Thank you, Cynthia. Thanks to everyone at the Atlantic Council for Global Energy for inviting me to speak at this important event. And it's wonderful to be with all of you and my fellow panelists to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Of course, this is not the way we want to be celebrating, fighting the most urgent health crisis of our lifetimes. The reduction in pollution that we are seeing is likely to be temporary, and it comes at a terrible cost of lives lost and economic instability. But here we are. This year is also the 50th anniversary of my organization, the Natural Resources Defense Council. We are an international NGO whose mission is to safeguard the earth, protect people, plants and animals, and natural systems upon which all life depends. We have over 3 million members and online activists supporting our work. I founded NRDC's program in China 25 years ago. We were the first international NGO to launch a clean energy program in China. We've been at the forefront of many of China's most exciting initiatives for decarbonization and environmental protection. And we now have 50 people in our Beijing office working to help China make that sustainable and decarbonized transition of its energy system and its economy. I'm going to talk about coal today. As you are seeing, every form of energy has its own environmental impacts, but coal is perhaps the most damaging. It's the world's dirtiest fossil fuel. To begin with, it's responsible for 40% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, which is already causing terrible impacts today in terms of wildfires, hurricanes, flooding, and other major extreme weather events. But coal also poisons our air and our water and destroys our environment every single day. These impacts take place at every stage of the process of producing coal, transporting it, burning it, and disposing of the significant wastes. I'm going to talk about air pollution because when coal is burned, it releases over 80 hazardous pollutants. And together, the health impacts from those pollutants can range from asthma and breathing difficulties to brain damage, heart problems, cancer, neurological difficulties, and premature death. A new study has just come out. It estimates that in 2018, 4.5 million people died from the pollution caused by fossil fuels. That includes oil and gas, as well as coal. And on average, each death was associated with a loss of over 19 years of life. Pollution from fossil fuels also led to additional 4 million new cases of childhood asthma, 2 million preterm births, and other impacts. The total economic and health impacts of fossil fuel burning is on the order of $8 billion every day. And new research has shown that coronavirus patients who are in areas of high air pollution are more likely to die from the illness than those in cleaner parts of the country. Coal is also the most thirsty of all energy sources. It uses a tremendous amount of water for mining, washing, power generation, and coal conversion operations. This mining and other waste disposal contaminates groundwater and nearby streams with toxic drainage and can render surface water unfit for agriculture and human consumption. Coal mining also severely affects the landscape, often removing entire mountaintops, displacing or destroying wildlife and habitat. It produces acid rain that ravages lakes and streams and forests, and coal burning produces millions of tons of toxic waste every year, including coal ash that is often contaminated with radioactive and toxic metals. So the picture is not pretty, to say the least, but it doesn't have to be this way. Coal is an 18th century energy source. It powered the Industrial Revolution. It powered China's rapid economic growth at the beginning of this century. But it's on its way out, and it's giving way slowly but surely to cleaner energy solutions of the 21st century, like renewable energy. In fact, it's already cheaper to build new renewables than new coal plants in every single market in the world. But it's already over half of the existing coal fleet is also already more expensive to run than building new renewable plants. And by 2030, it's going to be uneconomic to run existing coal plants when it's cheaper to just build new wind and solar. So people who are building, investing in new coal plants right now stand to lose some $600 billion in building plants that are going to become stranded assets soon after they're built. The good news is that coal use is slowing down throughout the world. For the last 4 years, the number of coal plants under development has dropped steeply in 2019. And despite the Trump administration's efforts to sustain the coal industry, it's not been successful in the United States, despite the fact that the current head of the Environmental Protection Agency is a former coal lobbyist who has done everything possible to weaken regulations for the pollution from coal plants. But China is the world's largest producer and consumer and importer of coal. And China's continuing to build coal plants, despite the fact that most of them are not needed and are uneconomic. And China, Japan, and Korea continue to finance coal plants overseas. Why is that? Why is coal hanging on? It's often because it still enjoys political clout. There are vested interests in every country that want to see coal continue. But also, on a more practical matter, coal has long provided jobs and tax revenue. So those have to be addressed if we're really going to meet what analysts say is a deadline. That is to phase out coal power completely by 2030 in OECD countries and no later than 2050 in the rest of the world. So how do we do that? How do we work together to phase out coal? I'm going to give you 3 quick suggestions. We can talk more about them. The first one is to follow the money. Who is financing? Who is investing? Who is subsidizing these coal plants? Well, the G20 pledged a decade ago to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Has it done so? No. They've almost tripled the subsidies they've given to coal-fired power plants in recent years. How about financing? Since the Paris Agreement, major world banks have poured $1.9 trillion into the fossil fuel industry. US banks are the worst offenders with respect to oil and gas, the most environmentally damaging forms of oil and gas. China leads the way in financing of coal mining and coal power. But over 45 banks have pledged that they will no longer finance coal plants. So that momentum has to continue. And right now we're seeing that every 2 weeks, a bank, an insurer, or a lender announces new coal restrictions. Divestment is another really important moment, and we're seeing that happening with more and more investors. Most recently, in January of this year, with BlackRock, the world's largest fund manager. They announced that they're going to cut companies that derive a quarter or more of their profits from coal. So following the money, there's a lot we can do to push all these efforts further faster. Then working together, there are many, many initiatives going on now. One I want to identify is the Powering Past Coal Alliance, a global alliance of nearly 100 national and subnational governments and businesses and organizations that are working to advance the transition away from unabated coal power generation. And finally, I hope that you will help us to work with China, who burns half of the world's coal, to make that transition that it has pledged away from fossil fuels. NRDC's been working with more than 20 government research institutes, think tanks, and even industry associations. And we together successfully advocated for a mandatory cap, national cap on coal consumption in China. But as their 14th five-year plan comes up, we think they can go a lot further. We're also working with provinces to help them meet that coal cap, to help them make that transition, a just transition for the workers who've spent their lives in the fossil fuel industry. China also already leads the world in clean energy jobs, and we think this transition can help create 1 million more new jobs in clean energy and energy efficiency. Thank you so much. Look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Emily.
Yeah, hi Cynthia. Hi everyone. Thank you for joining this interesting conversation. Happy Earth Day to you, everyone. I'll try to be as brief as possible, but I wanna maybe emphasize the fact that in order for our society to shift to renewable energy and to shift away from fossil fuels, I think it's critical that we abandon this idea that mining is some kind of an inconvenient truth and rather embrace the reality that mining for minerals associated with the technologies that will allow us as a society to move away from fossil fuels is in fact fundamental. And so when you look at sort of the mineral foundations of any kind of technology or any kind of the green energy applications or the energy solutions that my colleague spoke about earlier on, they come from minerals that have to be extracted and then processed. And that involves mining. And I think when you look at sort of taking a historical look back, especially in the United States, there's this idea that all mining activity looks like a coal mine from the 1800s, which is frankly not the case. However, this narrative or a rhetoric that says, okay, mining is an inconvenient truth, we're going to put it in a little box, we're going to stick it under the bed like a monster that we don't want to deal with, and advocate for wind energy when anybody who spent any time around a wind turbine really should understand and own it, that the technology that enables us to take energy from the wind comes from a gigantic metal device that involves, just at the outset, a tremendous increase in consumption of iron ore to make the steel, to make the towers, but also the rare earth extraction and processing that you need for the permanent magnets that enable the wind turbine to function, the massive increase in copper that will be needed to transition from a fuel-based to an electricity-based grid can't be ignored. And so this very conference that we're able to do, this very ability for us humans to be able to spend Earth Day together while we're undergoing a pandemic wouldn't be possible, without lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, manganese, and all kinds of minerals. And so I want to sort of be able to say that rather than saying, okay, inconvenient truth, monster under the bed, those of us who want to promote a cleaner future and renewable energy as the way that humanity and society powers itself going forward is to really advocate for a responsible and science-based approach to understanding mining so that we can do everything that we can to mitigate the undesired consequences to Earth and basically create a culture and a society that we replace this inconvenient truth narrative with fundamental but responsible. And I guess lastly, saying that when we as consumers understand where our products come from and what our products contain, that demand to extract minerals and to process minerals in the most responsible way possible, rather than having an anti-mining stance while cutting things up on your granite countertop, I think really can lead to a society where responsible capital goes to responsible products and responsible mining activities. Because if the part of the supply chain that is mining is treated as an inconvenient monster, you can draw your own conclusions about the kind of capital and then the kind of practices that'll be adopted there.
Thank you. Marco.
Good morning, Cynthia. Good morning, everyone. And let me first spend a word of gratitude to the Global Energy Center for not only this opportunity to be here, but also dedicating an event to this important anniversary. And I have to say, most of the panelists have already flagged the two crucial dimensions of the challenge that we're facing. On one hand, securing energy access and availability, ultimately access to growth and human development for the billions and billions of people who are going to be on Earth. Let me only remind you that more than 800 million people today have no access to electricity, 650 of which are concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. And on the other hand, making this in such a way that this development is compatible with a future and a good future for natural resources and the earth we live in. So, and thank you, Cynthia, for flagging the fact that it's climate change is an overarching global issue, but there is a plentiful of streams of work and reflections around the environmental footprint that we need to mitigate. A US writer, William Gibson, used to say something that I think well applies to the concept of transition we're in. He used to say, future is already here, it's only very unevenly distributed. And if you listen to my fellow panelists, I think it's definitely the case. We do have technologies, we do have some policies, we do have some ideas, but clearly this portion of legacy that we are still living in and that is still ensuring our daily life needs to be slowly but surely and potentially much quicker transitioned into the new world. Eni is an Italian company founded in 1953 that has embraced last year a new mission that the board of directors wrote around the SDGs. And there is a number of SDGs that are clearly critical to follow if we wish to take our business model and put it into a transitional framework. When we speak about the environment, clearly we have an SDG on health, an SDG on clean water, an SDG on responsible consumption and production, an SDG on life, on biodiversity, both underwater and on land. And for this to happen, the company has adopted a long-term strategy a few weeks ago that really consolidates this move from a legacy production into broadening our business model and our strategy throughout the energy chain. I would flag three dimensions here, then of course more than happy to drill down on each of them as we go forward. The first is we need to make our own present business more sustainable. This is a matter for individual companies. We are curbing flaring. We're coming to zero process flaring from upstream production. We're curbing water consumption by 2%, for example, year on year. In some locations, through technology, we went up to minus 50% of freshwater consumption. We need to mitigate the environmental footprint, and this is something that companies can do through technologies. But what has been recorded so far is also that clearly policies have to go in that direction. And we have to enable those policies that, for example, in the short term, in my home country, Italy, will allow for coal power generation to be phased out by 2025. That is the objective of the National Energy Plan. Or 2038 in Germany. I mean, in Italy today produces 13% of its power generation with coal. Germany was beyond 35 last year, is already under 30 this year. So policies count, but we need, for example, in the legacy business to make gas available and at competitive purposes to ensure the short-term phase out within the longer-term decarbonization picture. Then we do have, clearly, as was echoed by Mark, for example, at the beginning, we have the issue of deploying existing renewables. Eni is planning to invest for up to 1 gigawatt solar in this country, in the US. And I have to say, the critical dimension here will be how we go out of this very dire moment by safeguarding the energy transition as a core component of any recovery, of any economic recovery pathway. And in this way, we have to find new solutions, creative solutions. We have to be very careful in planning land use. I come from a country, Italy, that has a very difficult land use challenge because consumption centers are very, very dense. And of course, natural beauties and landscape is critical. So on expanding our business models, we have to take into the account how renewables will fit into their communities. And third, we should not abandon. On the contrary, we should reinforce the quest for technological breakthroughs. In the US, we are investing on nuclear fusion, for example, with the MIT. Throughout the world, we're investing on carbon capture and sequestration. We have launched a new technology for tidal energy with sea waves conversions. These new technologies will represent the major solution going forward. But last and least, these require an intensive work on two pillars. The first was echoed by Emily a few moments ago. Consumption patterns have to become aware and have to become responsible. So we have to work with our consumers, we have to work with our customers, we have to work with our communities and societies to join forces and go together in the transitional pathway. And last, we definitely need to invest in technology, and I'm proud to recall that Eni has launched the most powerful supercomputer in private hands, reaching 52 petaflops of capacity. And this really allows us to both, for example, mitigate enormously the impact of exploration in the upstream business, as much as it helps us in supplying data to new renewable technologies such as tidal, or today, unfortunately and sadly, as much as it helps us to support our communities in the quest of a vaccine against COVID. So I think energy players are key to make this cores of future enlarging their span and making the energy transition inclusive and accessible to everyone.
Thank you, Marco. And thank you to all of our panelists. You can see we have a wide range of views here and across the globe. We're happy to have that. You can begin to put in your questions now into the system, but let me kick things off. We talked a little bit about coal, quite a bit. Let's go back in geologic time to the 1800s. Barbara, here in the United States, there's a debate about whether coal is over or whether it's reemergent. And I know that's not true in the rest of the world. Coal is still a very big part of their energy systems. What have we learned over this time? How can we produce, burn, and dispose of coal in a way to minimize the impact on the environment?
Cynthia, that's a good question. We've learned a lot about ways to produce and use coal that has less impact on the environment, but we cannot reduce those impacts entirely to safe levels and healthy levels. And we're running into headwinds in the US. Last week, the Trump administration dramatically weakened the regulations that are in place to protect people from the mercury and toxic emissions from coal-fired power plants. They've saved thousands of lives. So that's what we're up against right now. But the fact of the matter is, you have to mine the coal, and the land will never go back to its previous use, no matter what you do, and unless you spend far too much to make coal even more expensive. But the real problem I have is that all of these efforts to reduce emissions from coal plants do nothing to reduce CO2 emissions unless you have even more expensive carbon capture and sequestration technology that is untested, not moving ahead very quickly in the world, and has its own environmental problems and energy intensity. So that's why I believe that the real solution, as we're seeing it happen now, is to phase away from coal completely. I think there's a lot of movement in that direction. It just has to happen faster.
Moving away from coal, yes, but in the interim, while we still have a majority of plants using coal for electricity generation, Marco, do you have any ideas, perhaps, of how we might make coal cleaner?
I would share Barbara's view that, especially in systems such as the European Union, most of the European Union energy systems, coal phase out is a priority per se. We are speaking today of local pollutants, but let us not forget that gas emits CO2 by the half of black coal, and even the 1/3 vis-a-vis some installations of brown coal. So phasing out coal requires three different typologies of solution. The first is being able to compensate for the loss in volumes by both adding renewables and gas in the short run. The second is critically building a network that sustains this evolution over time, and making our networks more intelligent, smarter, and way more diffuse. Just to give you an example, sorry for giving this anecdote again on my country, but I think it applies to a number of systems. In Italy, we moved from less than 1,000 power generation installations connected to the network to more than 800,000 power generation installations connected to the network in less than 10 years. So that was an enormous translation and transformation. And the third bit of moving away from coal is definitely making the consumers critically more aware and bringing them in. So to cut this long story short, we need to phase out coal where we can. And just to quote Fatih Birol of the International Energy Agency, even if we stopped new coal construction today, in 2050, coal will still remain the major emitting source on Earth. So we have to move fast and adopt all possible actions to mitigate its impact. It's an all of the above type of approach.
Any of the other panelists want to weigh in?
I think it's when looking at, and so, my personal family history, my dad's dad was a coal miner in Pennsylvania who worked night shifts. I think that understanding that coal is a thing of the past, and really understanding that the health consequences, the pollution consequences for developing countries, especially for poorer parts of the world that do depend on the coal mix, really should, to use the word, trump the financial interests or the powers that be that are trying to maintain coal as a part of an energy mix. I personally don't think there's the transition has to be as fast as possible to minimize these human costs. And I hope that there's a consensus that the human costs are the goal or are what we're looking to minimize.
Now, Barbara, you said that it's more expensive to run or build a coal plant, and we should follow the money. How do we get governments around the world to follow that money?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of organizations and initiatives going on right now where people are joining together to put pressure on their own governments, to put pressure on the G20, to really highlight the impacts of coal use and financing. We've got organizations now that are tracking every penny that every bank is spending on coal-fired power plants. We have technologies now to track every coal plant in the world and look at their emissions. These are tools that we didn't have before. And using the internet, we can join together in these various initiatives to to put pressure on them. Really, it's and make sure that governments, and my own in particular, understand how important it is to power past coal. We've got a lot of state action going on in the United States, even in the absence of federal initiatives here. So it's easy to start in your own state and at the local level to find out what's going on and to join it.
Cynthia,
Well, go ahead.
sorry, I just wanted to jump in on that because I really wanted to build on Barbara's response because I think that's spot on. The solution isn't just in the economics, though I think the economics will win out over time and the cost effectiveness of renewables. And we've seen what PV come down by like 80% in the last decade. So a wind similar. But so the economics are starting to win on their own, but there's nothing like entrenched interest, as you mentioned, right? And the stranded assets related to existing power plants. So the other way, as you were alluding to, Barbara, to move this at an accelerated pace is through smart policies and plans. And as you mentioned, states are moving in the direction of requiring a transition to renewables. We've seen 13 states plus the District of Columbia move to 100% renewable energy targets, ranging in the years of 2040 to 2050. Those are really aggressive targets. We might not be able to get to 100%, overnight, and we need technology to come with us a long ways. I mean, Emily, your industry of mining, we need solutions with sustainable materials and smart batteries, and we certainly agree that the solutions will be in technologies, but policies to drive us to those solutions are critical. And so I really applaud the states that are taking the lead, even when our federal government has not. And we're seeing similar moves around the world, not just with the Paris Accord, but with other national commitments.
Now, coal is not the only important energy resource that's mined. As Emily mentioned, lithium is a mineral that's integral to the economy, and there are other minerals and rare earth metals that support wind, solar, and defense and high-tech products that rely on mining. What does it take to get those minerals out of the ground in an environmentally friendly manner, and also to dispose of them?
I mean, Cynthia, the answer to that question is money. And it takes, responsibility. And I think that it's important to understand that the lowest carbon supply chains are likely going to be local. And by that I mean, if we say mining is inconvenient, and then we decide to essentially outsource the mineral extraction portion of a supply chain to a country where maybe they have much lower environmental standards, and they will take the top off that mountain, versus making a decision to do it in the United States, or making the decision to, as a US company, invest in doing this mine in a country, and making the much more expensive decision to put it underground. And then on top of that, the fossil fuel that's inherent in shipping these minerals back and forth and across the globe. If those environmental costs are not reflected in the economic costs, and if all mining is bad, then from the consumer standpoint, you accept it as an inconvenient truth and you move on, rather than understanding that, oh, maybe we could extract this graphite locally in Alabama. Maybe we could process this raw material into the spherical graphite that's needed to the coated spherical graphite that's needed to make a battery, at home in the Southeast, where we would be on an energy grid that's lower carbon in the first place, and we wouldn't have the fossil fuel emissions inherent in having to ship these things back and forth all over the world. And I'm making that argument as an economist, and not as an opponent of globalization. I think globalization is fantastic, but I think that the global economy that we have doesn't capture the costs to my lungs and my children's lungs for the carbon emissions inherent in saving, little margins here and there by shipping everything all over the world. But understanding that, lithium, it either comes from a rock that looks like this, or a saltwater underground here in South America, or a clay in Nevada, or a volcanic tuff in Peru. really having consumers understand and demand and be willing to pay more for products that are responsibly sourced. And then on the other hand, I think that the companies like BlackRock and companies that control the money, saying, right, we will invest in the mineral extraction and processing elements of this, rather than say, no matter how we do this, consumers are going to say, you invest in mining, you're bad, so we just leave it, we leave it to someone else. Responsibility means leadership, and to have responsible mining, those who advocate for responsible mining have to take the lead, and then it starts with money.
Okay, any of the other panelists want to weigh in on this question?
Can I just take a quick shot? No, I think, Emily, you'd probably agree, but beyond just money and advanced technology, I think there's an important geospatial siting element to where people put mines and deploy them. We've been working as TNC over the years with countries like Mongolia, where we've worked to identify those places that should and should not be mined. Just because there's a good natural resource under the ground doesn't necessarily mean it's the right place to exploit it. So with proper siting, and we've worked with that government to now set aside as much as 30% of lands, which really need to be off limits given where people live, where in this case, where they roam as nomadic people, and where there are really unique natural beauties. And so I think doing the proper upstream, we call development by design approach on these in national systems, in mining areas, is a critical response to planning for eventual mining locations.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that you have to, when you talk about a mineral extraction project, you're talking about something that will, a lifetime of 30, 40, 50 years that will leave an impact on where the project was, and properly planning and properly understanding, do we want to just take the top off this mountain? No, but do we want to build an advanced technologically sophisticated underground extraction operation? Potentially, it's not a black or white decision, and the grays that have to be understood to make responsible decisions require advanced scientific understanding, as well as an acknowledgement of the stakeholders of the project, which are in every case the local communities that will be impacted.
Well, let's move on to some more fossil fuels. With oil production being so prolific these days that producers may have to pay others to store it, can any additional environmental protections be afforded in the near future? And are there solutions right now, for example, with respect to flaring gas in some production areas? Or are other things that can mitigate environmental impacts?
Well,
Mark, why don't you take that on?
Yeah, I assume that question would somehow involve us. Now, that was a portion of what I was saying before. Yes, technology can definitely help us. In making our present production and our future production more and more sustainable. And we have to go that way. Clearly, the present scenario doesn't look promising in terms also of the quality of the new investments. But we have to keep a firm line on the level of technology and environmental quality that we can apply. Let me give you a few examples. You mentioned flaring. Well, we can commit to curb flaring. Of course, every region in the world has their own regulations. Actually, NE has set itself for zero process flaring. And this zero process flaring is a short-term objective that we're pursuing with reductions year on year. We can commit to curbing, for example, our water needs and recycling needs that we have. We have to commit to asset integrity, reducing security events, and enhancing technologies for oil spills. Just to give you an example, we are now launching and rolling out on global installations there now in Italy and in Africa so far, mechanisms for direct monitoring of pipelines and avoiding third-party intrusions that have allowed very significant results on oil spills, double-digit decreases. So there are existing solutions in the production bit, and as I mentioned, investing a lot on digital technologies can make exploration much safer. We have a very strong, very strong performance on exploration. That means drilling less wells for the same level of production. So yes, we within the perimeter of the transition, the present upstream business has the possibility to mitigate its environmental impacts and to foster its portfolio moving from oil to gas. And this is my last comment. We have been shifting our portfolio towards gas. That is now the majority of our reserves, and it will be reaching 85% in 2050. So it will be beyond 60% in 2030. So there is actions that can be taken here and now in the existing oil and gas supply chain.
One of our audience members mentions that earlier this week was the 10th anniversary of the BP blowout in the Gulf, and they want to know, are we any safer than we were a decade ago? Do you have a view on that, whether blowout preventers have been improved sufficiently to deal with deep water blowouts?
Well, all occasions and all cases have to be treated individually. What I can say, and speaking for my company, is that we have set ourselves a very stringent asset integrity and security targets, and we have always met them and overtaken them. So I have to say, this is a line we can go, and this line has to go with transparency, disclosure, and has to go hand in hand with policy. So
Mark, you have any? Sorry, Marco. Mark, do you have any comments about other things that we can do to improve oil and gas, oil production, or transportation, disposal?
Well, fundamentally, I think we should be making the transition away from dependency on oil and gas. In the transportation markets, we're seeing clear indications that that transformation is here to stay. That companies are moving to electric vehicles. That even with the dramatic drop in gasoline prices, most recently, that the investments in new both energy efficient and electric vehicles is continuing. We expect that to move forward. I think what ultimately, this won't mean the ultimate end of oil and gas, but it will in fact give us the luxury of being able to extend for many generations those fuels in the ground as a emergency basis, and we have access to it. But I think that even with low cost and safer extraction, we're moving in a world where renewables and energy efficiency solutions are really going to start to take over. But again, I'm talking about a 50-year horizon, and not just looking in response to the next 2 to 3 years.
And we have another audience member. Oh, go ahead, Marco.
Very quickly, building on what Mark has just said, I think especially in the next environment where we're going to have availability and low prices of fossil fuels, we have also to devise a strategy of decarbonization that includes liquids and gases. So in the transportation business, the role of biofuels has to increase. And in this way, I have to say a number of initiatives are going forward, for example, to evolving feedstocks and reduce dependence on palm oil. And secondarily, as a short term, in the short term, Mark was speaking in the long run. In the short term, for example, LNG has a tremendous opportunity in niches. Take, for example, maritime transport. This is an enormous issue in areas, in delicate regions of the world, such as the Mediterranean region, where fossil fuels are necessary for maritime transport, and fuel quality increase is essential. So there, for example, LNG can represent an immediate, short-term, immediately applicable solution to curb local pollution.
I think we could go on for another hour or so, but we're running out of time here. So why don't we take a couple of the audience questions I saw were related to nuclear power. And the question for the panel is their perspective on advanced nuclear technology. The notion that the designs are improving and there's a good safety record. Should we be relying on nuclear power more often?
I think that when you look at the new technology and the nuclear power question, nuclear energy as a sort of, I guess, not so much renewable energy, but as a carbon-free source of energy, it solves a major problem of intermittency, right? So when you talk about solar and wind, you talk about sources that are intermittent. You don't get that sort of solid block of energy. But on the flip side, and this is leaning a little bit philosophical, the ability of a society to adopt nuclear energy depends on a trust in the government that I don't think we have right now.
Emily, just picking up on that, sorry, real quickly. I mean, I think I personally am an all-ins kind of solutions guy, and I think that in the right circumstances, nuclear can provide that kind of carbon-free solution. But given trust and given what we've seen, and trust is represented in this case by lawsuits, by the legal pushback, and while the technology's costs may have come down, while the reliability and safety have come up, that hasn't stopped really challenges in terms of getting permitted and construction time. So existing nukes are now in the range of twice as expensive as new renewable energy solutions, and building a new nuclear plant is as much as 6 times the capital cost as what we see today with other conventionals and renewables. So if prices come down, they're going to have to come down by hundreds of % in order to make these cost effective again. We'll see what can happen in the very long term, but I think in the next decade, we're not going to see these on the, common on the market.
And I can add to that with respect to China. China is one of the countries that's putting the most funding into these advanced nuclear technologies. They have opened up a couple of new nuclear power plants. They are taking what Mark said, the kind of all of the above approach, but they're running into difficulties too. And in part because, as Emily said, public trust, it's become very difficult for them to justify site nuclear power plant along the highly populated eastern coastline. And the government knows that if there were to be an accident similar to the Fukushima accident that has really caused a lot of concern in China, that would be the government would be blamed, not the utility. But on the other hand, they're having a lot of trouble finding places to site nuclear power plants in the interior of the country because of just pressing water shortage. That's the problem with coal as well. China has one of the least per capita water availability in the world. And they're getting to the point where using more water, they use a large part of it for coal production. They use it and need to use fresh water for nuclear. They're at the point where the lack of available water is threatening their continued development. So nuclear power is very questionable.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks to all the panelists. I just want to thank everybody for joining us for this timely and productive conversation. Panelists, you did a great job. As I said, we go on for another hour or two. I'd also like to thank Laura Macedo, Jackson Tyron, Gray Johnson, who's leaving the council soon. Good luck to you. Zach Strauss, whose idea this was and put it all together, all those folks at the Atlantic Council. If you'd like to rewatch today's event or share a stream with a colleague, you can find a cached replay on the Atlantic Council website and YouTube channel. For more energy and climate content, join the Global Energy Center this Friday at 1:30 p.m. for the next installment in Energy Source Innovation Stream, where Bonnie Norman, president of E3 International, will discuss the prospect for sustainable biofuels. See you next time. Be safe, stay healthy,
Everyone.
pick up one piece of garbage
Bye.
at least today for the earth.
Happy
Thanks,
Earth.
Cynthia. Bye-bye.
Bye
Bye-bye.
bye. Thank you.